Hi, my name's Julian, and today I'm going to be talking about the history of Europe from 1804 to 1933. I believe that Napoleon Bonaparte caused World War II by starting a pattern of animosity between France and Central Europe, and by starting a ideological trend of nationalism. So we start in 1804, where Napoleon is the new leader of France. Now, before 1804, before Napoleon, the way wars worked in Europe was mostly they were fought with mercenary armies. So big countries such as France or Italy would pay these independent mercenary armies a certain amount of money to go to another country and take over. And there were two problems with that. First of all, the mercenaries were always going to fight for the highest bidder. So if the French paid a mercenary army 100,000 pounds of gold to fight Italy, they might get to Italy, and the Italian king could say, "Oh, we'll pay you 200,000 pounds of gold to turn around and try to fight France." So that caused them to be very expensive and not very effective. The second problem with mercenary armies is that if they were outmatched in battle, they would always surrender and run away rather than fight to the death because they only wanted the money. Napoleon started a whole different situation. He went to the French people and said, "We need to fight in the name of France and its ideas. We're not going to fight for money. We're not going to fight simply to take over other countries. We need to fight to spread the French ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and we need to fight to the death in order to do this," which is going to motivate the French people to join the army in enormous numbers and fight harder than any other army. And that is how Napoleon is able to expand so far. So much so that he goes into the Holy Roman Empire, which was sort of this amalgamation of Germanic tribes and little countries. One of the countries was called Prussia at the time. He's able to go into the Holy Roman Empire, and at the Battle of Austerlitz in December of 1805, he basically destroys an enormous army that's put together from the Holy Roman Empire and break apart this empire that has basically existed since the year 800, so for about 1,000 years. So in the period between 1815 and 1870, there's this whole area of Central Europe that's made up of like these separate nations that have been destroyed by Napoleon, but they're unified over two ideas. The first is that they all know that they despise France. They hate France so much from what Napoleon did back in 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz. The second thing that keeps them together is they have sort of a shared history. They know they were used to be a part of the Holy Roman Empire. So out steps Wilhelm I, who right now is the king of Prussia, which was one of the countries, one of the nations within the former Holy Roman Empire, and his advisor Otto von Bismarck. And the two get together in about 1860, and they realize that Central Europe could become a powerhouse of all of Europe and maybe all of the world if they capture that nationalism that Napoleon used to unify France and make it so powerful. So in July of 1870, they realize that if they can start a war between all these separate loose nations of Central Europe and France, then they can unify all of Central Europe and make it expand as far as the eye can see. And with that, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 was started. And it actually ended 1 year afterwards. So it was really quick, and it was a victory for the armies of Central Europe, for these Germanic tribes, for Prussia. And in June of 1871, they drove into France, drove into Paris, and they made the French sign a peace treaty called the Treaty of Frankfurt. Now, the Treaty of Frankfurt did two things to the relationship between Central Europe and France. First of all, it promoted nationalism. It did that by creating Germany. So it took all the Germanic tribes and Prussia and a little bit of Austria. They drew the lines, and Germany, the country, was created with Wilhelm as the Kaiser, the king, the ruler, the emperor of this German republic. The second thing that the Treaty of Frankfurt did in 1871 was it heightened the animosity between France and Germany even further, because it required France to pay 5 billion francs to Germany, which is a ridiculous amount of money. It's about $342 billion in today's money. So from 1871 to 1914, this animosity and nationalism stewed between France and Central Europe. Both countries just really, really hated each other. France was still ailing from Frankfurt and decided to form alliances with other countries out of this mutual disdain of Germany. They allied with Russia and Serbia and Great Britain. And these alliances, they were connections between these countries, but they also promoted nationalism within each country. The same thing happened with Germany. Germany was so pissed off at France for their history since Napoleon, of being attacked and having to fight back, that they started forming these alliances with other countries like Austria out of shared heritage and dislike of France. Again, it's this mixing of nationalism and animosity, one reinforcing the other. And it wasn't just in politics and economics. A lot of literature and philosophy came out that helped support this animosity, this nationalism within each country. For instance, Friedrich Nietzsche, who's this amazing German philosopher, in 1872 he wrote this book called Birth of a Tragedy, where he articulated the intertwined nationalism and animosity between the countries. He said that all history is a battle between two societies. There's the Apollo, the god of order and intelligence, which is fighting Dionysus, the god of drunkenness and pleasure. And he saw Germany as Apollo and France as Dionysus, locked in this eternal battle over the soul of the world. So this animosity stewed and built up until it exploded in June of 1914, when a Serbian fanatic assassinated the heir to the Austrian Empire, Franz Ferdinand. Now, the guy who did it in the name of Serbia. He was a nationalist himself, but because Serbia was connected to France in their mutual disdain of Germany, it set off an explosion which led to World War I. All of a sudden, you have Austria declaring war on Serbia, and Serbia asking Russia for help, and Russia declaring war on Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And then you have Germany declaring war on Russia and France and trying to go through Belgium to do so. So then you have France and Russia and Serbia and the United Kingdom and a bunch of other countries fighting against Germany. And it just sets off this huge, massive chain reaction of militaristic nationalism, which kept going until June of 1919. France eventually forced Germany and its allied nations into a ceasefire, and it made them sign the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles was basically the Treaty of Frankfurt from 1870, but with France as the victor. So it heightened the animosity by making Germany pay 132 billion German marks, which is an equivalent of $393 billion today. This broke down the political and economic life of Germany. So it heightened the animosity of the Treaty of Versailles. It also promoted nationalism. After this, France was rejoicing at how happy they were that they had finally beaten France, or that they had finally beaten Germany. And Germany was still anguishing, and both of those created this sort of love of a country, this pride in who they were. And just like between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I, nationalism and animosity stewed and solidified in the hearts and minds of both Germans and the French until one man came to power that used that intense anger, that intense nationalism to rise to power himself. By 1933, Adolf Hitler had used the anger within all German people at France to rise up politically and finally become Chancellor of Germany. So right now, Adolf Hitler is taking that nationalism and that animosity and moving it even further, not just talking about the German people, but the German race. And that idea is going to be so popular in Germany because of the animosity that stayed there since Napoleon. So the lesson here is that the story of World War II didn't just start with Adolf Hitler. It started way back with Napoleon, maybe even further. And it's possible that Hitler knew that. When he finally invaded France in 1940, the first place he went was the tomb of Napoleon. And when he looked at Napoleon's grave, he said to his advisors that it was the greatest and finest moment of his life. So perhaps he knew that he and Napoleon were linked through history.